All right, welcome. I'm Eli Clifton. I'm a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute. And it's my privilege to welcome you to this webinar hosted by the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, to discuss Amir Amirani's film, We Are Many. There is a link to the film in the confirmation emails you've received for this event, or you can go to wearemany.com to see different options for viewing the film or accessing it, depending on what country you're in. We Are Many is the never before told story of the largest demonstration in human history, and the movement created by a small band of activists who changed the world. On February 15th, 2003, up to 30 million people, many of whom had never demonstrated before in their lives, came out in nearly 800 cities around the world to protest against the impending Iraq war. The New York Times called this movement the second superpower. This fearless, thought-provoking documentary is the remarkable inside story behind the first ever global demonstration and its surprising and unreported legacy. Joining me here today is Amir Amirani, the director of the film, Assal, a senior research director at NIAC, and Kate Kizer, the policy director of Win Without War. I'll start off by asking a few questions, as is my prerogative, and then hopefully we will have lots of time to take audience questions. Please enter your questions as we have this discussion. You can enter it in the Q&A box in Zoom, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. I'd like to start off with a question for you, Amir. How do you view the past 4 years in the context of the film's hopeful conclusion that the mass mobilization opposing the Iraq war carries on to this day in the public's engagement with foreign policy? We've just had a US election with record turnout in our nation's history, and it was also one of the most divisive. The outcome of it is still being debated in the courts and in the news media. Do you see the seeds for the broad-based coalition building that was shown in your film within the US now, and potentially between Americans and other like-minded activists in other countries? Or on the other hand, are Americans seen as more hopelessly divided and incapable of building bridges than they were in 2003? Amir, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I'm getting used to this. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I certainly don't think that people abroad, or certainly here, see Americans as hopelessly disunited. In a way, I think people see the last 4 years as a kind of aberration. I can see that movements here and key figures here are in touch with people over there. I mean, for example, a movement called Progressives International, which is a kind of movement and organization to unite progressives to kind of resist the kind of right-wing kind of backlash. So I think that I'm hopeful. When I see what's been happening recently with Black Lives Matter, and especially in the context of the elections, it's interesting to note that the current head of Move On, who is half Iranian actually, and one of the key figures in one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, both reference the 2003 anti-war movement as formative and critical to their life in political, activism. So I'm very hopeful. I think the fact that there has been this huge turnout is a sign that activism is alive and well. And I think a lot of people are crediting Black Lives Matter for turning out the vote, critical vote. So the last 4 years, I think, despite the divisive nature of kind of Washington, politics, I think I'm hopeful in the light of the legacy of the 2003 protests and where it's brought us to now.
Thank you. Assal, from your perspective at NIAC, have international efforts to pressure the US and its allies from engaging in military strikes against Iran benefited from the 2003 mobilization that was shown in the film against war with Iraq? Or are we mostly living in the shadows of what was, in some sense, a failed effort to avoid an unnecessary war?
There's a few things. I think first, it certainly affected the US psyche about war, right? So even under this administration, even under the Trump administration, one of the platforms of Trump when he was running was to end endless wars, right? He was anti-war, he was against the Iraq war. That was a key. So this shows that there is, we talk about bipartisan efforts all the time. Well, here's one bipartisan thing that people agree on, actually: being against war, wanting to end endless wars carried out by the US, especially in the Middle East, which has been our experience of the last several decades. So I certainly think that that psyche that has trickled into both sides of American, we talk about a divided America, but here this idea is clear on both sides. And so I do think that we can sort of lament the idea that we still invaded Iraq in 2003, but the idea that it had an impact, I would say without a doubt, it had an impact on the way that we think about war. And an anecdote that I have: when I was in undergrad when we were building up to the Iraq War and when we invaded Iraq, and one of my sociology professors, who was the most popular professor on campus, was an expert in the Vietnam War. And before the Iraq War started, so leading up to it, knowing that this is what was going to happen, I remember he sat in front of the class and he said, "When I was your age, we started the war in Vietnam." It's like, I graduated undergrad, went to graduate school, got married, had kids. We were still at war in Vietnam. And he said then, that is your future. That's what will happen to you sitting in this room. And in 2003, a sociology professor sitting in California predicted exactly what was going to happen. From then, I experienced the exact same thing. And I think there's an entire generation that has experienced that, right? You have the war in Afghanistan, you have the war in Iraq, that have lasted lifetimes for people who are of this generation. And I think that's why you see in the discourse about Iran, despite the fact that we're certainly seeing parallels and buildup, you still see the majority of Americans against war, whether they be Republican, Democrat, or independent. The majority of Americans have also been against, including Republicans, have been against the Trump administration's policy towards Iran, because of that very fact, because of the fear that we might find ourselves in yet another war. So I think that those protests, without a doubt, have had an impact on where we see ourselves today, whether it be specifically an anti-war protest, or as Amir so aptly pointed out, the fact that we saw mass protests in the United States during a pandemic, where people were afraid to go outside. They put on their masks and they went and they protested. And that certainly galvanized people to vote in unprecedented numbers in US history. So, hoping for a continuation of people understanding that it is through our mobilization that we hold our governments accountable and that we actually do have a voice and agency.
Thank you. And I would just like to follow up briefly, if I may. And I'm speaking as a journalist here, so I'm very often the pessimist in the room. And I guess I'm curious that you're right that actually it was very interesting to see that on both sides of the political spectrum and both candidates in the general election talked about ending the endless wars. At the same time, Donald Trump, who really broke with the status quo as a candidate in 2015 in talking about this issue, to be fair to him, he has not entered the United States into another war in the Middle East, as many were afraid he would do. But one of the criticisms of him is that, well, he also hasn't extricated the United States either. What does it say about our political process or our policymakers that these views and positions about getting the United States out of these wars, which, as you pointed out, are widely supported by the general public, so far haven't quite translated into actionable policy?
Well, I think that's a question across the board for all of our policies, including our domestic policies, right? And so we're at a sort of inflection point in American history, arguably. I mean, we're at a global inflection point where really the experiment of the nation state and democracy is something relatively new. And I say this as a historian, so forgive me, but is relatively new in human history. And that experiment is still, there's a lot of kinks to be worked out, especially in the US case. This is not a situation where we've somehow achieved a democracy and now the job is done. Right now, as we are sitting here, our democracy is being undermined by the very administration that is currently in power. You have a Secretary of State in Mike Pompeo who, blatantly says that this is an hour ago that we're seeing that there will be a peaceful transition to a second Trump administration, despite the fact that we have a president-elect Joe Biden. All of this shows that there's still a lot of work to be done in our democratic processes. And so while while yes, to his credit, Trump did not start a new war, we were on the brink of war at the beginning of this year. And, talking about January 2020 seems like a lifetime ago, given everything that's happened this year, but we were on the brink of war. And in reality, what stopped us from going any further was restraint on the side of Iran. And that's something to really think about. That should be we should let that sink in. We are still hoping in the next 70 days that we will see restraint on the side of Iran, because we know we're not seeing it on our own side. In fact, we have an administration that just said that they're going to have a deluge of sanctions on Iran, all to tie the hands of a future administration. That's not, that's undermining the very processes that we're talking about. If the American people have spoken in an election, then they have said that what that mandate is, the meaning of it is that they are criticizing the policies thus far. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm not the journalist, so maybe I like to be on the optimistic side, is that as long as we do it, as long as we are out there making our voices heard, whether it's through voting, whether it's through, and the work doesn't finish, right? We're not done because we voted. And I would look at the idea of protests and why protest is so important, right? Civil disobedience and protest are important for this very reason. It's why it's within our Constitution, in our first right, argued in our Constitution. There's a reason for it. It's a pillar of democracy. So, without encouraging anything specific during a pandemic, if in fact we see that right now something is being sabotaged or undermined, we have a tool that we can use, and that is our voices, and that could be done through protest.
Thank you. Kate, now putting in the context of obviously what Assal was just mentioning about the news about an hour ago of Mike Pompeo referencing that there will be a transition to a second Trump administration, something that runs counter to, for instance, what the Electoral College is telling us right now. But assuming that he is wrong, what does the future of anti-war foreign policy advocacy look like under a Biden administration that's desperate, it would seem, to return the US to a sense of normalcy, but doesn't appear to want to rock the boat with regard to US policy in the Middle East, or an effort, and as well as their what seems to be a get tough on China trajectory that's shared by both parties? Is it possible to find a more restrained foreign policy in an era in which simply undoing Trumpism writ large and returning to normal seems to be the top priority for the incoming, anticipate, administration?
It's a very good question, Eli. And I'll just say that the idea of just defeating Trumpism as the key priority, I think is a little short-sighted, because that's a generational project, right? In this country, we have a large portion of the electorate who really believe that. And I think that's where what Assal was talking about in terms of the kind of popularity of anti-war ideas across the political spectrum really comes into play as one interesting issue that the American public largely remains united on when we are in this era of deep polarization and, I think potential violence, especially in the next 70 days, we will see. Thankfully, I think, we're in a place hopefully where the pathetic attempts to further undermine the election that the administration is taking are revealed for what they are. And I think that, we've seen that even just over the last weekend, which has been great. But I think, so under a Biden administration, I think, it could look like a mixed bag. I think, the president-elect has made his views clear in terms of how he views endless war, and he believes in continuing drone strikes and special operations raids and things around the world. But when he was in the Obama administration, he was also an advocate for ending the war in Iraq and drawing down Afghanistan and being against the surge. And so I think there's kind of data points on both sides, right? And this is where I think personnel really becomes policy, and that's a very normalized idea, I think, amongst, particularly on the left, for domestic policy, but hasn't largely been talked about on foreign policy or within the national security bureaucracy because it has traditionally been such a kind of a gate-kept community, that you have to have a certain pedigree and background in order to access those levels of power where decisions actually get made. And I think the key difference between, you know, the Obama years, you know, where he had a mandate, he ran on ending endless war similarly, and now is that there is a deeply organized progressive movement in this country that didn't exist when Obama came into office. And so, you know, he had the right instincts, but because there was no kind of organized public to push forward alternative ideas of how the US could actually address security challenges without trying to bomb our way to peace, that traditionally has not worked ever. You know, he was kind of out in the cold and had to hire advisors who disagreed with him. And so the fact that this movement is organized and more just regular folks are, I think, starting to really, unfortunately, viscerally feel the links between how the US conducts itself abroad and the militarism and violence that produces at home is becoming quite apparent to regular people. And that's where, you know, the movement for Black Lives was one of the first movement actors to come out with a truly internationalist perspective, an agenda of what they wanted to achieve. And I think given that that's really at the root of that movement, it's a really exciting time because we can then combine forces and understand that if we're against war in Iran, we're against war on the streets of Ferguson or in Minneapolis as well, right? And I think that's where the anti-war movement has some work to do. We don't have, you know, enough quote unquote experts to staff a full administration yet, but we do have, you know, I think pretty straightforward, reasonable policies that we want to achieve that we really think could make the world better under a Joe Biden administration, right? Kind of, he's talking about his administration as like kind of getting to the next administration, right? Kind of that bridge administration. And so I think really that, as we've seen how he's moved on climate, there's a real opportunity to push him to our side and to think big and bold on foreign policy. You know, it's not necessarily, I would say, his traditional advisor's tendency to go there, but I also think 2020 has been quite an unprecedented year. And I think it's influenced kind of a lot of their thinking. And so, you know, we're not going to win across the board on a lot of issues. There will likely be a mixture of, you know, supporting what the president-elect wants to do while also holding him accountable to implementing the most peaceful and constructive policies possible as he tries to, you know, move back to the new normal. But what I think has been really interesting is over the course of the pandemic, you know, when he first started his campaign, there was a lot of talk about Biden and he wanting to return to the new normal. And I think his instincts still are there, but since the kind of the duration of the pandemic, something he said this fall, I think shows his evolution in that he finally publicly said that Trump is not Trump is merely a system or a symptom of a broken system, right? And that fundamental change, right, should indicate then that like it's not about tinkering with the system. It's about fully thinking about what a reformation looks like, redefining what U.S. national interests are, who they serve, and how we can then actually, I think, you know, build cooperation where we need to on the shared existential threats that we're going to face this century. That really, you know, these like geopolitical proxy wars that the U.S. has involved itself in over the last decades is a distraction to actually addressing those existential challenges like the climate crisis.
Thanks, Kate. And to those of you in the audience, I see we're getting some questions coming into the Q&A. Please continue to send them in, and we'll turn to those in just a moment. I did want to circle back just quickly to Amir and ask, you know, the film shows a fascinating moment in history in 2003. And in viewing it, it really hit home to me what a different advocacy and mass mobilization space we're in now, in that the film shows people connecting in a very human way that social media now can enable, but can also do a pretty effective job of spoiling. So I guess I would ask, how does a more divided US and UK for that matter impact the future of mass mobilizations in the context of social media and other things that we probably don't even fully understand that have orchestrated a very or created a much more divided political climate now. We've shown an ability to bring more people to the streets in a sense, and that's what we've seen over the past 4 years. Certainly Black Lives Matter is a fantastic example of that. But do you think that we're talking past each other maybe in ways that differ from 2003? Or can those be still overcome in the same manner in which was shown in the film?
Yeah, it's interesting. In 2003, there was no social media, and apart from email and face-to-face meetings, and yet this huge global demonstration was organized in eventually 72 countries. And today, there's a danger. I mean, I'd be really interested to know the extent to which the protests on the streets came about as a result of social media, or good old-fashioned mouth to mouth, word of mouth, sort of, and people just sort of seeing it on television. Certainly in Egypt, as an anecdote, in the Egyptian revolution, that was very much a kind of word of mouth, and there was this idea that it was all social media. And in fact, many activists on the ground in Egypt said, it really wasn't. In fact, one of the things they used to do would be sort of say, okay, we want to meet in Tahrir Square tomorrow. So they'd go and call up Al Jazeera, and they'd say, tons of us are going to get together in Tahrir Square tomorrow. Al Jazeera would put that out, and then of course, sure, lots of people would turn out in Tahrir Square. So, and of course, there's always the danger of sort of filter bubbles. You mentioned, Eli, talking about talking past each other. I think there are communities that don't engage at all. So there's definitely a space for social media. I don't know to what extent there is clicktivism, and to what extent the numbers out on the street are more about old-fashioned organizing at the grassroots level. But both have their space, and I think that if there were another talk of war on Iran, would we see the same turnout? To be honest, I don't know. I mean, in a way, you're better placed to answer that question in the US. In the UK, certainly the anti-war movement is not. It's still going. The Stop the War Coalition is still active. Can it get the numbers out again? I don't know. I don't know whether 2003 was a kind of high water mark and the stars aligned in such a way that and it was shortly after 2003 the anti-globalization movement also fed into the peace movement, and together what came out of it was greater than the sum of their parts. Whether that will happen again today is a really interesting question. I'd be interested to know what the audience think and what you think as well.
I can piggyback on that if that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think Amir's point is interesting in saying that the social media is a tool that we can use, and it's a new tool basically. But sometimes I think we put too much emphasis on the role of social media. And, Amir and I are both from a country that had a revolution 41 years ago with no social media, with no internet, right? There was none of that. It was flyers and cassette tapes. And that's how, that's how the word got out, and that's how people became aware of what was going on. The United States and France had revolutions in the, 18th century. So this isn't the idea of people power, essentially, being galvanized and people coming together and holding someone accountable is nothing new. And the only thing that social media adds is another tool to do it. And I think sometimes, because Eli, you pointed to this, that sometimes it can spoil it. And I think that's why it's important, right? Sometimes people get sucked into the idea that social media is where all of our voices are. And it really isn't, because it's also where there's a lot of, to be completely honest, false voices, fake voices. It's also a very easy platform to manipulate. And so I wouldn't get too caught up on whether social media is truth-telling, and more so on how we can use it as one of many tools in our arsenal for trying to have these collective movements. And something else that Amir pointed out about 2003 being this sort of moment and whether or not we can see a repeat of that moment. I think in certain ways we have, right? Over the last, leading up to the pandemic, there were demonstrations in so many countries in the world, demonstrations repeatedly, week after week after week. And I think the difference that we're seeing in a point where you looked at 2003 had a very specific thing to point at, right? It was like, oh, we're watching this build up to a war that no one on the planet wants to happen. And there were certain vested interests and people in positions of power that could carry it out regardless of what everybody thought. And that was really the only point that we could look at to say this is a problem. What we're seeing now are so many problems that are converging that you see protests all over the world, whether it's in South America, whether it's in North America, whether it's in the Middle East or East Asia or Europe. You're seeing protests everywhere. It's just that and it'll be interesting to see whether or not you can create a unifying sort of messaging behind what are clearly movements that are happening everywhere. So, you know, I'm hopeful in the sense that there are clearly grievances everywhere, and whether or not we can bring those grievances together under a larger umbrella will define whether or not we'll have that kind of moment that we had in 2003.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to some of the questions that are coming in now. And this one comes from Tom Grover, who writes, since the end of World War II, the US has been, and this is quoting Martin Luther King, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And end up today that not has changed, no matter the sparse public demonstrations, writes Tom. What has to occur now with a man, this is presumably Joe Biden, who says nothing will fundamentally change? That seems like a good question for you, Kate, or unless any of you want to jump in as well.
It's a very good question. I mean, I think the question is whether there will be a united movement to hold Joe Biden accountable to some of the promises and rhetoric that he has talked about. Particularly when it comes to war ultimately is a democracy issue. If Joe Biden wants to, quote unquote, restore the soul of the United States, foreign policy can't be absent part of that restoration, right? And I think that requires a deep, thoughtful analysis of the various impacts, negative and maybe positive, of the US kind of perpetual war posture, at least over the last 20 years. And I think, but, you know, I think there's a lot of forces, particularly institutions within the US government, who don't want that to happen. And I think that's where the question of, do we have an organized movement to actually push for him to be better, quite frankly, on a lot of these issues, right? And learn from his past mistakes as well as the past mistakes of the country. And I think it remains an open door. I'm hopeful. Almost all of the Democratic primary was debated on foreign policy. Well, the questions were certainly right-wing, but a lot of the talking points and the framing in the debates on foreign policy were progressive framing in terms of, no, we should be getting out of the Middle East, right? And kind of talking through these things that just have not been talked about for the last 20 years. And I think there's, the other aspect of this is it's not just Joe Biden. We still have a democratically controlled House, perhaps a democratically controlled Senate. We'll see in January. But even if the Senate stays Republican, the reality is that there's now an organized progressive membership in the House of Representatives who have organized themselves on foreign policy and are growing their ranks. And so I think, they are very interested in keeping up the fights that they started under the Trump administration. Because, as we've talked about, this is kind of a bipartisan failure in a lot of ways. A lot of the bad things continue to recur because there's largely no accountability in the national security space for people or their ideas. And I think that's where movements and empowered champions in Congress can really be a critical ally to changing that.
Thanks, Kate. We have another question here, this one from Sahand Yazdanyar, who asks, there seems to be a lot of optimism behind a so-called JCPOA 2.0 under a Biden administration. However, the calculus for an agreement has changed significantly since the original JCPOA. Biden would have to make this a top priority within his first 100 days and deal with international opposition. for example, from Mohammed bin Salman, from Benjamin Netanyahu, et cetera, as well as pushback from the domestic side, complaints about too many concessions, and the same tired lines, this person says, from United Against Nuclear Iran, the Foundation for Defense Democracies, et cetera. What do US-Iran relations look like if a JCPOA 2.0 is not reached? How will the upcoming Iranian elections impact future diplomacy? Assal, this seems like a good one for you.
Sure. Well, there's some talk within the sort of like foreign policy world in DC about whether or not a Biden administration should come in and use the leverage that the Trump administration has created. And I put it in quotes because it's arguable whether or not that's considered leverage. I think it's key, and I agree with the person who asked the question, with Sahand, because it's key that if the US wants to move back to diplomacy, which Biden has made clear multiple times that that's what he wants to do, that it's done sooner rather than later. I think it's naive to think that the Iranian election has no bearing on what the US does, because that's the entire problem with the framing. It's always, well, it doesn't matter what happens in Iran because it just matters what we do. And that's not actually how anything works. There's two sides. They are human beings. They have a side. And whether or not we agree with it is really not the point. The point is you have to engage with it. And the point is they exist. And it's the sort of basic psychology that I feel like is often missing in a conversation about US foreign policy. And that's because of our position of power. We exist in a position of power and assume that anything we say is just, it's sacred because we said it. We assume that any resistance isn't really important, but it is. So if our goal, and what was the goal of the JCPOA? Let's be perfectly clear what the goal of the JCPOA was: to prevent a nuclear Iran. It was a model for denuclearization because it is vitally important, not just to American security interests, but to global security interests, that not just Iran, but every state complies with certain standards of how to have a nuclear program. The threat of nuclear weapons and nuclear war is not something that will affect any particular nation state. It is a global threat. And that's why we had an international coalition come together to have this agreement. And so to preserve that, to make sure that we're on the right path when it comes to denuclearization, we need to get back to where we were. And that's why it should be addressed by the Biden administration very, very early on. If you're the Biden administration, and this is why I say when you listen to this sort of like debate that goes on in DC, I find it fascinating. If you're the Biden administration and you try to leverage anything, doesn't that legitimate Trump? Didn't you just undermine your own administration, which created this deal? And now you're saying that, yeah, what Trump did is great because look, now we have leverage. Instead, what would make sense for a Biden administration to do is to lift sanctions on Iran beyond because of the reasons that are articulated in the JCPOA, because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And because the international community has called not just for lifting sanctions on Iran, but for lifting sanctions on anyone who's fighting the pandemic. It's ironic, actually, that when we talk about the JCPOA, we're talking about a global threat of nuclear power and nuclear proliferation, right? And the pandemic is a global issue. So it's ironic that we are in this global threat of this spreading pandemic, and yet we're still undermining the idea of the fact that cooperation is the way to get around it, right? That's the only way. As long as the pandemic exists somewhere, it can affect everybody. So this is the time to come together. And what this administration has done is completely fail at that test, not only domestically, but on an international scale. Because as long as we continue to sanction all of these countries and they can't fight the pandemic, then it continues to be a problem globally. So I do think that a Biden administration would have to deal with how they want to return to the JCPOA, how they want to return to diplomacy, maybe is the best way of saying it, prior to an Iranian election, which will be 6 months later, in June.
Thank you. Now, another interesting question that comes up here, and I think this is one that I'd like to direct to Amir, even though this is very US politics centric, but it does have to do with the ecosystem in which advocacy and protest are occurring. This question comes from Roy Cheyenne, who asks, don't you think that dark money and the victory of Citizens United in the Supreme Court helped lead to or caused the war profiteering and racism that led to the profiteering and the Iraq invasion and occupation? and perhaps even led to a Trump administration. So I guess the broader question is, has the opening of floodgates of political money in the United States fundamentally changed the political environment and ecosystem in which advocacy folks can engage?
Well, I'm not so well versed in the finer points of American domestic politics. I mean, I know a little bit about Citizens United and the ludicrous nature of it, and how much money has flooded into and changed the kind of the landscape. I mean, I'm sure that must have played a part. I mean, to this day, I get asked questions to why do I think the United States invaded Iraq? Is it to do with oil? Is it unfinished business with the Bush family? I mean, who really knows? And as to the question of whether that was what led to Trump, that's an even a bigger question. I mean, what is interesting is that we had we had a leader here, Tony Blair, who was a sort of a centrist third way person. Of course, that's certainly not what Bush was. But people talk about Joe Biden as, and maybe Obama as more of a sort of a centrist figure. Certainly, Joe Biden, I think, would describe himself as a sort of centrist figure. But the Democratic Party, having sort of moved more center and vacated the space where they might have spoken for kind of the traditional base, opened up a space for maybe the rise of somebody like Trump. Someone, I mean, Tony Blair, to this day, nobody really knows why, he went along with, this wasn't Britain's fight. And we don't have dark money here in the way that you do. So I think maybe Kate and Assal could talk more about how you see the place of dark money in the kind of advocacy that you do. But it's a puzzle to me.
I'm happy to. I think Eli, sorry. I think that the pervasiveness of money in politics has not left any industry untouched. And I think since that decision, the climate movement, the democracy revival movement in the US has been, very as well as, political organizations like Justice Democrats, right, that are getting candidates to pledge not to take PAC money or corporate money. There's really been a lot of organizing, right, to kind of push back against that erosive nature of money in our political system. But where that hasn't happened is the arms industry. Up until last year, really, talking about reducing the Pentagon's budget in Washington was still considered extremely taboo. There were votes earlier this year. I'm sorry, what is time? It might have been last year on reducing the Pentagon's budget. I believe it was this summer, in both the House and the Senate. And while those votes failed, it was like the first time that Congress had actually voted on what they think the top line of the Pentagon budget should be and if they should reduce that. And I think that is an incredible progress that we had, groupings of Democratic members finally voting to say, yes, I want to reduce the Pentagon's budget. And I think, part of that has been, as we've seen through the pandemic, and particularly the Pentagon's desire to get COVID relief money, and not just the Pentagon, but their contractors. Nearly half of the Pentagon's budget actually goes to private security defense contractors. So the US public is actually subsidizing these giant corporations that then give multi-million-dollar bonuses to their CEOs, just like we've seen in Wall Street, just like we've seen in the fossil fuel industry. And I think, if we really want to attack kind of some of the economic drivers to our foreign policy decisions, we need to look at how campaign finance reform is really a vital silver bullet to changing the influence of money in foreign policy making. And also just within how Congress engages with foreign policy, most of the folks on the Armed Services Committees in Congress all take defense contractor money. And it's also in the House in particular, that's typically where leadership puts many members, at least within the Democratic Party, who take corporate dollars because there's been organizing to prevent those members from joining other committees, right? Where we don't want someone who has deep investments in the fossil fuel industry on the Energy Committee that's overseeing, right, how the US is going to engage in this energy revolution we're seeing, and whether we'll go green and make deep investments, because they have a clear conflict of interest. And the arms industry is no different, but that hasn't been talked about. But the great hope in my mind is that one silver lining of the Trump presidency is that corruption is a lightning rod in American politics again. And just like kind of, anti-war wide public support, there is wide public support for actually attacking corruption. You saw Trump leverage that and then not do anything about it with his drain the swamp rhetoric. But I think that's where many progressives on the left are concerned about where Biden might go on foreign policy, because many of his advisors have gone through the revolving door of government and industry. And, in this day and age, after 4 years of Trump and the massive and blatant corruption that we saw, progressives in particular really want commitments to prevent those conflicts of interest from arising and hampering US policies in the future.
Kate, kind of continuing on the topic of potentially of the role of Congress on perhaps related or unrelated note here, a question from Kaveh Rod, which is, I'm very concerned that given the limited time Trump has to hand over the keys to the sports car of the presidency, I think he'll try to wreck it quickly before doing so. And maybe one method would be to provoke a quick war with Iran. I should probably at least start a quick war with Iran, leaving Biden and co. to deal with it. Are there safeguards in place to prevent this type of possible rapid escalation? And are we optimistic about mass resistance in case, given that 70 million Americans voted for the man to be reelected?
Well, I mean, theoretically, there are safeguards, but in practice, there aren't a lot, mostly because Trump has shown that he's continually willing to break the law to do whatever he wants. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani was a case in point of that. But, the experience of that assassination earlier this year also showed that there was a mass public awareness and activation that they didn't want to go to war. And so there were protests all over the country in January, from places, in DC and San Francisco, but also in Kansas, and places that you wouldn't really expect folks to even be tracking this, right? And I think, that to me, and that organizing that occurred and it's continued, and there's, various coalitions that have been stood up to continue to track this stuff, right? Because I think vigilance is really the only way to protect against it and to continue educating the public that there is this risk here. And so, that can look like everything from questioning, quote unquote, intelligence reports of assassinations that the administration decides to leak, right, to try to provoke either a reaction or justify taking military action. And I think it'll be up to not only folks in DC or activists who are watching this closely, but then also, expanding that out, that the one thing that's on our side is that war with Iran remains highly unpopular, even amongst Trump's own base. And so I do think there is, what I think is more likely, unfortunately, is that one of the United States allies does something, and that sets off a series of events that become uncontrollable. And, we're doing all we can for that. But unfortunately, I think this is why, over the last 4 years, a lot of us have really come to come to terms with the need for real structural reform in foreign policy in terms of reasserting Congress's power over war making, because they've let that atrophy really since 9/11. And we saw, glimpses of that when Soleimani was assassinated, about the war in Yemen over the last several years. But the question, I think, is like, will that keep up? And then will that transfer to a Democratic president? Because, many politicians become shy of their own shadows once someone from their own party is in a place of power. They don't want to rock that boat. So it'll be all up to us organizing is the short answer.
Another question now from Mali Hakimi, who asks, could you please discuss if you see any relation between all these DoD personnel purges, which would have included, I guess, the Secretary of Defense, and policies towards Iran during the following 2 months? Maybe I am paranoid, but I am scared that all these very anti-Iran, and even more than the existing ones, Islamophobic people coming in. Assal, would you like to take a crack at that?
Sure. I don't want to sound alarm bells, right? Like, I don't want to be an alarmist, which is why I agree with Kate in that I don't think that on the US side, a sort of unprovoked war would just be started, right? It's not popular within the US, including in Trump's own base, as Kate pointed out. So I don't think that is necessarily what will happen. The bigger fear I do think is that, you sort of have not even a false flag, but just some incident, right? You're looking at the situation right now as a tinderbox, and you have some incident that even the US doesn't instigate, but from there's some kind of domino effect, and then that's when you get into a conflict. I said this at the beginning, and this is why I think that, again, this should sink in. I am hopefully optimistic for Iranian restraint, right? Because they have been calculating and waiting for a US presidential election. And this is why they've really not taken any kind of drastic moves on anything, despite the fact that they've been sanctioned just over and over again during a pandemic. And what we can all hope, and what should be, I think it's interesting, we never talk about the international community. We never talk about the fact that when the US is doing something, there is something called the international community. There are international laws. And it's, again, it goes back to this idea that because we're in a position of power, when we want to go to war with someone, we usually have to have some kind of coalition. We usually ask, does this make sense? And even if it's like a tiny coalition of a bunch of island states, we still come up with something. We don't completely unilaterally act. And so I don't think you're going to get that anywhere, right? There is no reasonable excuse to start a conflict with Iran. And the world's reaction, actually, if you want to sort of judge how the world is seeing the US right now, you can see it in how they're reacting to President-elect Joe Biden, right? You're getting more congratulatory messages from the international community than you are from members of Congress and actually, members of our own government. So I don't think that there will be, I don't think that we should be alarmist. I don't think we should start sort of panicking, and because I think it serves no purpose regardless. But I do think we need to be vigilant in having our voices be heard. And I do think that if there is any indication that this is something that may happen, for instance, let's say, the incident that Kate and I are referring to, let's say something does happen, and suddenly now you see the point where you think, oh, maybe this is going to be used as an excuse. That's when people need to mobilize. You need to have a mobilized response, and it needs to not just be domestically within the United States, but there needs to be calls from the international community as well to say that this would be a completely, US-owned event, and the hopes that it doesn't get to a stage where it can't be undone, right? That's the biggest fear that we all have over the next 70 days, is that something will happen that a Biden administration can't do anything about. And that hasn't happened yet. And you hear people say things like, oh, because there's sanctions, a Biden administration can't do X, Y, and Z. They can. They can, right? As long as we haven't gone into a full-blown war where the Iranian side now refuses to concede anything, there's always a way back. And I'm not saying that to be optimistic. I'm saying it because that's precisely what the Trump administration did, right? Everyone said, oh, he can't do this or he can't do that. But guess what he did? He did. So apparently you do have the power to do certain things. And I think that we should be cautious as we move forward. And if there is anything that, like I said, indicates, then that's the time for us to mobilize.
This question, I think, is from Pere Pakravan, and it asks interesting questions that I think I would be best answered by Amir, which is, and Perry asks, Trump got 6 million votes this time, to 6 million more votes than he did in 2016. And if the risk of war with Iran was not too large, some argue that, war with Iran would have already started. Some pose a moral question about whether the war would enter the consciousness of the majority of Americans. Now, putting aside maybe how that played into Trump's political calculus, because, well, we know he chose not to go to war. I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on where you see the status of, transnational mobilization with regards to opposing a U.S. Military action against Iran. And how you would, again, compare that to 2003.
Yeah, I mean, whether it would impinge on the consciousness of Americans is, that's a impossible question to answer. And again, I'll go back to what we were talking about before, comparing 2003 to now. I think there are more movements. There are more kind of grassroots movements, and increasingly, as a result of 2003, funnily enough, those international networks exists, and I think are stronger. I think in the film, actually, Ron Kovic said that since 2003, they all see themselves as an international movement, and I think Katie, was talking earlier about how I think more and more people are connecting the dots about sort of racism and militarism abroad, and actually racism and militarism, at home. Whether that is going to be sufficient to, if there were a threat of war against Iran, to bring people out, I think so, and I think actually there's a new generation. I mean, anecdotally, just looking back from 2003, onwards, we had, there was the Arab revolutions, and then you had Occupy, and since we've had the Women's March and the Poor People's Campaign, and so on. There are so many more. If you did a Venn diagram, there'd be a huge overlap. There was the Climate March. Again, if you did a global map of hotspots of protests and you overlaid them, there'd be a pretty good match with the anti-war protests. So I think there's a generational feed through, and I think that there is a more engaged, younger group of people who will, maybe they don't recall the 2003 protests very well, but I think that the spirit of protest is out there, as we've seen in America.
Thank you. We're starting to run low on time, so I'd like to ask one last question and actually get an answer from all three of you. And I'll start with Amir, because I think it's jumping off of some of the points you were just making. But given that we're speaking mostly to an American audience and we're forever stuck in the 4-year cycle and we're in an interesting spot in it right now, what issues and causes do you see intersectional and perhaps transnational activism mobilizing in the next 4 years around, and perhaps even having a tangible impact?
Well, I think in the whole idea of intersectional movements is vital. I don't know how much that is a part of a general discourse, but I think certainly the topic of the moment, as it is here in the UK, as in America, race and militarism are two big, and police, those are all connected. And of course, climate, again, we've been so accustomed to think of all of these things as silos. For many, many years, people have talked about, you can't separate them out, and they're all connected. And I suppose I would say that the climate emergency and race and militarism are maybe the three pillars and three movements that are going to be seen as very connected and intersectional. And I'm in that sense, I'm hopeful.
Assal, can we get your answer?
I agree with Amir, and I think I think there's one piece missing. I would put all of this under a larger umbrella, which is everything that we just described. If we're talking about militarism, if we're talking about race, if we're talking about climate, it always affects a certain group of people more than everybody else, and that's poor people. So I think that, and earlier I mentioned, you had all of these different movements in different countries in the world, and I think that we can't have a conversation about global mobilization or mass movements without addressing wealth inequality, without addressing the fact that at the core of all these issues, there are interests that make money off of everything we just said, right? Why do we have a climate crisis? Because certain corporations make money off of not caring about the environment. Why do we have militarism? Because certain corporations make money off of war. And so when you profit off of what is a disaster for masses of people, there's this imbalance. And I think that is a core piece of the issue. And I was, when we talk about it in the US, there's sometimes a lack of optimism, because it's always like, well, if you talk about wealth inequality, assuming everybody starts going to, well, we can't be like Finland and we can't be like Sweden. It's like, well, nobody's arguing to be that. We can be like America of the 20th century that created the American middle class. There's a phrase called the American dream that's very often used. What do you think they were referring to? The fact that we actually had a progressive movement in this country 120 years ago, right? So at the turn of the 20th century, you had all of this, we had very similar issues, very parallel issues, stemming from wealth inequality and stemming from the fact that our government didn't really have power. Corporations did, moneyed interests did, essentially oligarchs did. And so what we did, what Americans did, is they took that power back, because in fact, a democracy, a government that is for and by and of the people, is one that actually cares about what's happening to the people. And so that is very much a fabric of our own history and our own narrative and our own story. So it's not a matter of comparing ourselves to other states. It's not a matter of talking about these specific issues, but understanding how these issues all tie into a much larger issue. And that is part of American history. And I think what we're seeing, that it has a similar, calling it progressives now, is a similar desire simply to take back power for people. That's the core issue, in my opinion.
Kate?
Fully co-sign everything that's been said, and I don't have too much to add. But I will just underscore the point that Assal just made in terms of, I think we talked briefly before the pandemic about just these continual popular protests that we're seeing in every region of the world. And I think, that common thread there is that people want their governments to put people first, right? And I think that is something that we can build on because it's digestible. People understand that it resonates with folks, right? But I think the reality is as the nation state likely becomes, like, not to go back to the historian wonkiness, but as it becomes less important and, in an era of globalization, citizens are going to start identifying in different ways, not just their nationality, but based on things that they care about deeply. And so, I think in the 21st century, it behooves us to think through how each issue actually can be intersectional. Because at the end of the day, all of these issues and systems of oppression intersect, and they are what keep the status quo in place. And so we have to be able to build across movements and share our analysis and show how we actually all have a shared analysis. And I think the more we're able to do that and make those connections within our borders and across borders, the more powerful we will become. That won't, on the flip side, the other side will continue to be incredibly powerful. Corporations are amassing more and more power every day. And so I think these next 4 years will be that pivotal inflection point that Assal was talking about at the beginning, of where the people determine where we want to go from here.
Thanks, Kate. We are out of time. Thank you, NIAC, for hosting this event. And thank you, Amir, for allowing us to use your excellent film, We Are Many, as a jumping off point for this discussion, especially for those of us who are in the US and are trying to make sense of the world in which we're finding ourselves. You can for all of you that are watching, in the chat box, there is a link to a URL where you can rent wearemany.com, We Are Many, or you can go to wearemany.com to check it out, especially if you are in other countries around the world. Thanks, Assal, and thank you, Kate, for offering such good, timely analysis for the world we're in now. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Eli.
Thank you, Eli. Thanks, everyone.